Have you ever scrolled through social media and seen a post where someone is celebrating like a certain A1C and that feeling, that like lump comes up in the back of your throat and you feel really jealous and inadequate? Maybe you've been called a perfectionist and you have that temperament where you really, really rather things go according to your very, very carefully made plans. Then you've hit one of the trickiest things in the world of type 1 diabetes, which is feeling like you need to manage everything perfectly all the time. So let's talk about why that's actually maybe not true. It's not true. And how we can start to manage these feelings. Hey everyone, and welcome to T1D World, where we talk all about the emotional and psychological side of type 1 diabetes. There is no such thing as perfection with T1D, and that's actually okay. There are way too many things that can impact glucose to expect that these numbers will be in range all of the time and constantly behave themselves. And despite what you see on social media, no one is doing this perfectly. Remember, social media is a snapshot, and what you're seeing is not representative of everyone's reality all the time, even though it can definitely feel that way. Okay, so if we're talking about these things, it's kind of like, well, why wouldn't I double down, right? Like, this is my health or my kids' health that we're talking about here. I have to do this. Well, number one is perfection with type 1 diabetes is not a realistic expectation. So what's unique about diabetes is that it's a condition that is up to the people who live with it to manage it. This can be incredibly empowering, and it can also be really difficult because you have this illusion of control. And the truth is, there will be times when you do everything right? You follow all the rules and the formulas and you count everything, and you won't get the blood glucose that you were expecting. A person with diabetes can eat the exact same thing 2 days in a row, and they can get different blood glucose numbers, right? We simply do not know how to account for everything yet. I think we give insulin technology a lot of credit for being able to fix a lot of things. There's so much help that we're getting with that management. But at this point, these tools just aren't able to achieve the same biological results that a working pancreas can. In fact, the most recent data is there to back that up. The Type 1 Diabetes Exchange tells us that only 17% of kids under the age of 18 and 21% of adults 18 and older are able to achieve target A1Cs. So what we know is that actually only a minority of people are meeting these goals. Number two is that it's exhausting. Right? It's exhausting if your mood completely depends on a number that you can't really fully control. Like we were saying, right? You can have the same thing 2 days in a row and get different numbers. Stress and diabetes distress are really, really common things when perfectionism is so loud. And even diabetes burnout, where the demands of the condition become so big, and the frustration and that pressure to be perfect are so in your face that it actually just becomes really, really painful and overwhelming and defeating to look at. So what people do is they disengage or they start to ignore it. Diabetes is a marathon, not a sprint. This condition is 24/7. It's on all the time. And being perfect 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you could see how that would be a recipe for disaster. One thing that's important here, I think those individual numbers can really kind of make us feel really scared. But what we want to do is look at how are things happening over time. There's a third thing that can happen here as a result of that pressure to be perfect, and that is it can create anxiety, whether you're the person with diabetes or the caregiver. So for caregivers, when you show a drive for perfection, your kid may start to worry about disappointing you or letting you down. And that can do two things. One is that it creates an environment of anxiety and fear. And two, it can really put stress on your relationship. When there's so much pressure on a kid to do perfectly, right, to follow the exact meal plan that you have laid out or get the exact blood sugar, it can lead to them not being honest because they don't want to incur your wrath or they don't want to make you upset. The flip side of this is if you can model for your child or teen how to roll with the punches, you're creating a much more supportive environment for them. Meanwhile, if you're the person with diabetes, a perfection mindset can add a layer of stress and anxiety to a condition that is already pretty darn anxiety provoking. What we know is that anxiety takes us out of the moment. It's physically stressful for our bodies. It impacts our relationships. And as we've said before, it can contribute to diabetes burnout. So how do we get out of the perfection mindset. There are actually a lot of ways to address this, but let's talk about 3 of our favorites. Number 1 is focus on the positive. Make a list of what is going well. And if you're a caregiver, be sure to include what your kid is doing well. What we want to do is highlight these strengths that you have and the places that you're able to make an impact around diabetes management. So when you're making that list, start with noticing personal strengths. Everyone who's watching this has already been patient and shown grit and perseverance and the ability to multitask. Think about some of your wins so far and times that you did things even though they were hard, like leaving your T1D child with a babysitter or exercising even though you were worried about going low, or sharing that you have T1D with friends or colleagues. Another success might be the ways that you've changed habits or mindsets, like trying a new injection site or wearing a medical ID or being less reactive to individual blood glucose numbers that are not where you wish that they would be. The second thing you can do is watch your mouth. Let me explain what I mean here. Taking the judgment out of language that we use can help you to reduce your levels of diabetes distress and anxiety. A big one here is seeing numbers not as bad or good. You might try in range or out of range or just high or low, right? So if I showed you 306, right? If I said, okay, well, you have a bad number. Okay. And then maybe if I also said, or I described it as, hey, your blood sugar is out of range. Do you notice the difference there, right? Just even in the feelings that come up, and we're talking about the exact same blood sugar. The judgment doesn't help us to take effective action. In fact, it might even get in the way a little. Another language shift that I think can be helpful here is going from the idea of controlling diabetes to managing diabetes. There are still variables in diabetes that we can't control and we don't know how to account for, like illness or hormones or stress. So it can be incredibly helpful if you can pivot from this idea of, I am supposed to control diabetes and bend it to my will, which is actually not possible, to instead trying to think about, okay, I'm managing diabetes. And the third thing is to talk with your team. A lot of times people will get butterflies before their diabetes clinic visits. And I totally hear you. I have been there. Maybe you didn't do everything that you were supposed to do, or you weren't totally on top of it. I think we worry that our provider is going to judge us. But talking with your team about your feelings is actually a really, really important part of diabetes management. Because remember, being successful with type 1 diabetes is not just about paying attention to glucose numbers, right? There's also an emotional and a social adjustment. And so your team needs to know when you're struggling with feelings of failing or falling short or perfectionism. They can offer resources, or they can even answer questions that might help you out a little. Like if you wanted to check in with them about what your goals actually are for time and range. Now, of course, this is individual, but the general guideline for time and range is about 70%. It is not 100%. A 70% is not a C. 70% is awesome. Add that to the list of things that you are doing well if you're even close. The science and research shows that glucoses do not have to be 100% perfect 100% of the time in order to live a long and healthy life. So let's recap. Perfection in type 1 diabetes is just not realistic. No one does this perfectly. Perfection can be exhausting. It can lead to burnout, and for kids, that pressure can create a lot of anxiety and put pressure on your relationship. There are a few strategies we can use to manage this pressure to be perfect and to help reduce diabetes distress and anxiety. First, focus on the positive. Second, use neutral, non-judgmental language. And third, talk honestly with your diabetes team if you feel like you're struggling. The goal for most people with T1D is to be in range about 70% of the time, not 100%. That's it for this video. If it was helpful to you, please be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks again so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.